woman, you're looking at the character, the Pakistani law professor. But you're doing it through the eyes, through the mind of Dr. Oliver Harding. If you could tell us that thought process, how you went about doing that.
Yeah, sure. So for me, the idea was to get into this, get under the skin of a white male English professor and a middle-aged man who's a campus, who's on campus America at a university. And he's sexually obsessed with this Pakistani hijabi law professor at his university. So the idea was to subvert that gaze on, of a white man on a brown woman and an exotic, like the exotic woman, and to sort of reveal the workings of his mind and his body while assuming his voice, right? But also then telling the story from under his skin and etc. So the New York Times has called it a no-holds-barred comic achievement, and that's my little plug here. But yeah, I mean, it was important for me to do it as satire and do it as dark humor. And the idea was really, in the publishing industry in the US right now, there is this focus on, people of color telling their stories of trauma and, all of that stuff. And I just feel like we need all kinds of stories. But for me, it was a feminist act to take over this man's voice and expose him for who he is. While he thinks that he's talking to people like him, he's really talking to a very different audience. So I was connecting with my audience through his voice and showing him up in that thing. So those are the feminist. I mean, I can only write feminist books, and feminism then to me is also to show how he is trapped in this. Like, he could have this love and he could have these relationships with people from across the world, but he's trapped because no one, as Shobha said, there are women who enable men as well, enable the patriarchy. He has had no one really stop him. And so he's just gone on, and now he's dug himself into a position from which he can't extricate himself even for love.
Sugi, if I would just come to Brotherless Night. In that, you have your very strong character of Sashi, a 16-year-old girl who's doing her advanced level, hoping to go into medical school. You also have her mother, you have her grandmother, you have Mrs. Anthony Pillay, you have all these very, very strong characters. What was the thinking behind this? You have, for example, in that section about the women's front, where you have really brought out the point that the men said, let's just wait and see. Let's wait, let's have patience. But the women actually took action. The women did something. And you have that scene of a completely different scenario unfolding where the father comes home and the mother doesn't even receive him. When you look at those very strong female characters in your book, how do these come across? What is the response you have received, for example, from readers, from people who have reviewed the book? How has that come across?
So chapter 5 of Brotherless Night is called What the Women Said, and it is a depiction of the Mother's Front, specifically a march that took place, and that was organized largely by women whose sons had been detained. And I was fortunate to speak to women who had been present at the march, women who had been involved in organizing it, and it was fascinating to get a sense of how activism had been different then. When I organized things, I have a WhatsApp group. They went door to door and knocked because they were often organizing with others who didn't necessarily have phones. So just a completely different mode of collective action. And that, I think, was the power of that story to me, was that they were so hell-bent on getting their children back that nothing could stop them. They were very organized, they were meticulous, they made sure massive numbers of women showed up, and they didn't take no for an answer, not from the men in their own families, who felt maybe in some ways less able to speak than they did, and not from the state. So it was really an incredible privilege to hear from the people who had done that organizing, and an interesting challenge to try to represent that collective action in which they were not really interested in, they weren't interested in credit, they were just interested in getting it done, which I think is a hallmark of how women work a lot of the time.
Thank you. So,